And welcome back. David Ewing is our guest tonight to talk about the holiday Juneteenth. It is now officially our latest federal holiday in the United States. We haven't had a new one in quite some time, so I think it was the 80s last time we had one.
It was probably the Martin Luther King holiday.
I think you're probably right about that. We have a few questions on the line, so let's get to Joe on line 1. Joe, welcome to OpenLine.
Hello. I was going to say I don't ever hardly hear about John Brown, but I think there's only one statue of him in the United States. But I know he lost 2 sons, and he gave his life also to help free the slaves. That raid on some arsenal. But anyway, I'd like if the gentleman knows anything about it, I'd sure like to hear a little more about that also. But anyway, I appreciate you letting me speak.
Absolutely,
Thank
Joe.
you.
Thanks for calling in, and I think we have the right person here tonight to talk about that.
Yeah, John Brown was a very popular figure in the 19th century, a white man who was an abolitionist who literally just kind of rallied the troops back then to, forcefully carry the message of abolitionists. There were Quaker abolitionists and people that did it in a more quiet way or in a writing way, but he was fiery. And he was someone that, caller mentioned that there's one statue of him probably in Maryland, but, slavery didn't end just overnight. I mean, the proclamation and the end of the Civil War, but it took lots of years of pushing and pulling and, a war literally to end that.
Absolutely, and that could even open us up to a whole different line of conversation just about statues and the Tennessee Historical Commission that gets into all of that, and as we were talking about with last summer, there is kind of that glaring question of what happens to the statue right there over the Motlow Tunnel, of whether that would be replaced or come back, and that's a whole another conversation. But definitely, statues can be an interesting conversation when we get into these type of topics.
I vote for Dolly. I want Dolly to have. I know she said, "Oh, shucks, no thanks," but everyone agrees on Dolly,
which is the most Dolly response too, right? I'm sure that will come one day, and everybody will be happy about it. We have Teresa on line 2. Teresa, welcome to OpenLine. Are you listening with us?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yes, my name is Teresa, and I'm calling to ask the question about the 18th, October the 24th, 1864, when the slaves of Tennessee was freed by Andrew Johnson, who later became the 16th president of the United States, because the emancipation that Lincoln signed only freed the slaves in Confederate states. Even though Tennessee was a Confederate state, it was, the Union had conquered it. So therefore, the slaves in Tennessee did not get freed until 1864.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for your call.
This is a very interesting question. So she's right that, our former governor, Andrew Johnson was the military governor of the state of Tennessee when the Union Army came in here and took over the capital of Nashville. And so he talks about this in a speech when he's president, actually, around 1868, that he claimed, according to Andrew Johnson, he went to the steps of the Capitol and declared that slavery was no longer valid in the state of Tennessee, and that he declared it illegal and freed all the slaves. And during that speech in 1868, he says that Lincoln tried to free the slaves, but that emancipation did not free one slave, and it was Johnson that freed the slaves of Tennessee. And he even in that same speech called himself the Moses of the African American community. So he was trying to take, now kind of like the Emancipation Proclamation, okay, he stands on the Capitol and says all the slaves are free. That really didn't happen in Tennessee.
Right. I think my first question would be, was there really any impact from that? It may have been a symbolic gesture,
Yes.
but did anything really happen? And two, does it ring the same if you declare yourself that versus
Yes.
someone else designating that for you?
Yes. When the African Americans met at the Capitol years later to celebrate January 1st, they called Abraham Lincoln Moses II, that he was the one that kind of liberated everyone. You know, Andrew Johnson, and it's interesting, when they had that speech at the state capitol, they were criticizing the state of Tennessee in around 1870 for not ratifying the 15th Amendment, which gave African American men the right to vote. And so not only did they have a celebration of the Emancipation Proclamation on its anniversary for people that were enslaved themselves, they used that occasion to call out politicians that weren't doing right by African American people. It will be really interesting if some of these Juneteenth celebrations that are happening in Middle Tennessee are just celebrations, or there's more of a political bent about, well, what about this, and what about housing, and what about transportation, and what about healthcare, and some other issues.
It's interesting that you bring that up for the organizer that we spoke to for the Clarksville event on Saturday, and there are two, but the specific one for the Clarksville Juneteenth Festival out at the Wilma Rudolph Center, they are actually including some of those things that you mentioned. They're going to have some speakers that talk about some of the political issues of the day. They're going to have some get out the vote volunteers to help register people to vote. So it sounds like that's kind of a great allusion to the spirit of the day.
But for many, many decades after the Emancipation Proclamation, the African American community celebrated the Emancipation Proclamation in this city with gatherings and parades and just joyous events that they really saw that, even though it wasn't celebrated by most people, it was their time to celebrate, because in their lives they remember what it was before they were freed. And so that was a very important date to African Americans in the 19th century in the state of Tennessee.
Now, did those celebrations continue, or did they kind of taper off through a certain period?
Once the people that were formerly enslaved kind of died off or got a certain age, then all that kind of stopped.
That's that's interesting.
Very similar to a lot of the Confederate celebrations that were really, really big when there were a bunch of veterans, and then of course more people kind of picked up that baton, then picked up the emancipation baton of their children and grandchildren and such.
Absolutely. We have Bridget on the line for us. Bridget, go ahead with your comment or question.
Yes, how you doing?
I'm good, Bridget. How are you?
I'm doing okay. My question is basically, well, it's not so much a question, it's a comment. My comment is basically that slavery is still on the books in Tennessee. So slavery is not abolished until that is removed. And also, I have a comment about the fact that, we're talking about these men as if, they didn't have anything to do with slavery. Slavery was wrong. Slavery was done to us and our ancestors. And, I say us because those are our ancestors, and it was wrong. And I don't understand why people don't know the history. I just don't understand why people have not even tried to learn the Black history. And I'm glad we have that holiday, but we have a long, long way to go. So I just want everybody to realize we have a long, long way to go. It is not over. So you guys have a wonderful day.
Thank you so much, Bridget, and great points made by her.
Yes, there was a bill to amend, slavery was still in the Constitution for certain prisoners and other people. It wasn't what we kind of traditionally saw as slavery, that the buying and selling of people to just forced labor, basically, and that you own someone. It was almost a definition, although it was called slavery, that certain prisoners and certain other people that the state had purview over could be seen as that are incarcerated. And it literally takes amending the Constitution to kind of remove that. And then they've started the process, but it's a lengthy process to do that.
Absolutely. Except for people that really follow that closely, well, a lot of our viewers may not have known that is, at least, in some fashion, still on the text there.
And Chris, as you know, a lot of people will say, hey, well, there are no slaves living today. I didn't personally own any slaves. And a very small percentage of the white population, less than 10%, owned slaves. But a lot of people profited from slavery, even that didn't own slaves. And I'll give you an example. Slaves were used as collateral for banks. And so if you were a bank and you made a loan to somebody, you made money based on the collateral of slavery. If you were a lawyer and you were drafting a document of selling a slave for someone, you might not have owned a slave, but you're drafting a document to sell a slave, you got paid for that. A lot of railroads, of course, were built by slave labor. People traveled on them. So even the people that did not directly own slaves, they profited from this system of slavery that really propped up a lot of our economy back in the South before the Civil War.
Absolutely. Earlier in our last segment, you mentioned some of your family history here in Tennessee. I'm curious, is that from kind of an oral tradition within your family, or did you do some research, or is it a combination of both?
It's a combination of both. My great-great-grandfather, Prince Albert Ewing, was born enslaved here on March 28th, 1849, he and his twin brother. And he became the first African-American lawyer in Nashville in 1871. His brother Taylor also became a lawyer in 1886. And so there's a lot of documentation of them. And, he stayed at Travelers Rest where Taylor escaped and came to downtown Nashville, joined First Baptist Church on Broadway. Now, that church was a white church that had an African-American minister by the name of Nelson Mary, who was an enslaved person given to the church in the 1840s. And they decided to train him and teach him, baptized him in the Cumberland River, and gave him the African-American ministry at this white church. And during the Civil War, the Confederates and the white people fled the church, and so Nelson Mary ran that church. And my ancestor joined that church in 1872 when he came to Nashville. And later, it was that same minister, Nelson Mary, that started the historic First Baptist Church, Capitol Hill, and he was the first black ordained minister. So it's interesting. And so when slavery was over, the white congregation of First Baptist came back to the congregation, and the African Americans were like, well, wait a minute, we like kind of running the church ourselves. And so they helped them raise $70,000 to build their own church at the time, and Nelson Mary ran that church. And that's the same church that Kelly Miller Smith Sr. led, and that Dr. King spoke at, and that trained the students from Diane Nash to John Lewis in that church, the nonviolent protests. And of course today, Kelly Miller Smith's son, Kelly Miller Smith Jr., who's my minister, leads that church.
That is a fascinating history that I bet a lot of Nashvilleians don't know. So that is really remarkable. I didn't know posing you that question would give us such an interesting history lesson there on Nashville, and I think it goes to show just how generations through of history we need to continue to share these stories so that people know that history. We'll have much more with David in just a moment after this break. Stay with us.